Hi, this is Jason. Before we hop into this week's episode of the Speak with People podcast, I want to make sure you knew about two exciting opportunities. The first is, have you heard about our healthy communication skills training program for your company or organization? This is an opportunity for you to invest and build in the communication culture of your organization. When you do, we know and we have seen that staff morale, staff unity go through the roof, and you'll be able to deepen your customer and client relationships by building a healthy and strong communication culture. The second is this. We're in this series called How to Tell a Really Good Story. We have a free gift for you. If you just go to speakwithpeople.com/really good story, there's a free download that will help you walk through how you can tell a really good story. Now, get ready for this week's episode of the Speak with People podcast. Well, welcome to the Speak with People podcast. My name is Jason Raitz. I'm so glad that you are joining us today. We believe that healthy communication is oxygen for your relationships and your leadership. So whether you communicate one-on-one to a team, from a stage, or from behind a screen, we hope that the time today in this podcast will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you to communicate in healthy ways, because we know when you do, you really will change your world with your words. Well, today I am so excited because we continue our series, How to Tell a Really Good Story. Storytelling is so incredibly important in life. And today I'm so excited because we're diving deep into the art of storytelling. We're going to unveil some secrets behind crafting narratives and how do we tell stories that we can kind of hold our audience's attentions, from plot twists to characters to settings to suspense, all those different kind of things that make up stories. And so the other question that I think many leaders ask is, can just anyone tell a really good story? And so we're going to dive into that as well. And I'm so excited because we have an incredible guest today. He is the author of many, many books, but he's written just an incredible book, Storyworthy, that has impacted my leadership and communication in incredible ways. And he's written novels, spoke at TEDx events, teaches elementary school. I mean, the list just goes on and on. I just want to welcome you, Matthew Dix, to the podcast, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, hey, just in case our audience doesn't know, could you tell us a little bit more about your story, who you are, what you do, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. I think you did a pretty good job of it. My day job is an elementary school teacher for the last 25 years.
Wow.
I've been publishing novels and books of nonfiction for the last, 15 years. And since 2011, I have been standing on stages around the world, telling stories, doing comedy, delivering talks. And somehow along the way, that became a business that snowballed into this weird thing that I do now, as my wife often says, where I speak to, the vice presidents of Fortune 100 companies, and I speak to attorneys. And yesterday I was speaking to the hostage negotiation unit of the FBI, because it turns out they have to tell good stories too.
Wow.
Olympic athletes and Mount Everest climbers and Santa Clauses and priests and ministers and rabbis. Yeah, it's a weird thing, but I've sort of become a person who has found his way into teaching storytelling to all these people in a way I didn't really expect. It was honestly a business person who first approached me after seeing me perform at some charity event. And he said, I want you to help me with my company. And I said, I don't really think I can help you. I just tell stories on stages. And he said, oh, no, you can help me. And I doubted him, but he remains my first client and is still my client today, along with many, many others. So he sort of
Wow.
opened the door. Yeah.
That's just
So
incredible.
unexpected.
Yeah. And like we talked about offline, Patriots fan, Yankees fan.
Yes.
I have the privilege of living like 18 miles from Steinbrenner Field down here in Tampa. So spring training games are just fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I grew up just outside of Boston. So
Okay.
I was a Celtics, Bruins, and Patriots fan, but I hated my stepfather, and he was a Red Sox fan. He was a terrible person. So I would tune in channel 13 on the antenna and watch Yankees games to spite him, and it took that
Yeah.
it somehow stuck. And so I'm a weird guy who grew up near Boston, but am a Yankees fan.
I love it. If I pan my camera, my wall is filled with Ted Williams pictures. So even though I grew up in Detroit, man, I just love the Splendid Splinter. So
Yeah.
it was fantastic. Well, I appreciate you jumping into this conversation. I feel like I have a million questions, anyways, just because I've loved your work from afar and trying to grow as a storyteller. But we'll just kind of start with I mean, storytelling has been in a such an integral part of human culture for centuries. In your opinion, what really does make a story, the art of storytelling, so exceptional, so timeless?
Well, the thing about storytelling is we remember stories and we basically don't remember very much else.
Mm,
You can watch a movie and you are likely, if you enjoyed that movie, to see it again and again and again. You probably
yep.
have movies that you've seen 20 times, and you probably have 500 movies that you can tell me the plot and the characters and the
Right.
events perfectly too. But if you go to a conference and you listen to someone speak on a topic, even a topic that you care about deeply, something you're invested in, 2 days later, you probably can't remember most of what that person said. Our
Mm,
brains are wired for stories. And originally it was because we couldn't write anything down. And so, in order for our species to live, we had to know that, like that berry bush over there, those berries killed Uncle John. So, we're not going to eat those berries. And that becomes a story that keeps us alive, right? And so until we could write not very long ago when we developed writing, the only way we carried information from one generation to another was through stories. So we
mm.
really have a brain that is suited to story more than anything else.
Wow. We forget
Yeah.
about that so often. I mean, I was thinking the other day about trying to tell my kids stories of my grandpa because they never met, my grandpa. And I was just thinking, my generation, my grandkids, my great grandkids, my great, they'll just be able to Google me,
Yeah.
and watch my YouTube videos. You know, I mean, for how many
Yeah.
thousands of years, we lost sight of all those stories.
Right. I often say, like, every single person who, let's say, was alive in 1802, almost every single one of them has been completely forgotten, unless they
Wow.
cured a
Yep.
disease, won a battle,
Right.
got elected to a significant office, had a statue built to them. I mean, a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of people alive in 1802 are known today. And it
Wow.
wasn't that long ago. For you, it was probably your great, great, great grandfather, and you can't tell me that person's name, their occupation, where they lived. It's all
Nope.
lost because
Yeah.
we don't hold on to these things.
Oh, that's gonna. So for you in your journey, when did stories and I mean, captivate you? When did the art of storytelling really take hold in your life?
I think I was young when it captivated me. When I was like 12, I wrote a letter to Steven Spielberg after I saw the movie E.T., complaining about one of the scenes in the movie that I thought was just atrocious. And, basically the letter said something like, I love your movies, but there's always a stupid scene or two in each one of them. So if you send me the copy of the movie ahead of time, I can watch it and tell you what stupid thing you're doing. And, it wasn't until
Oh,
like 4 years ago that it occurred to me, my mother never sent that letter. I had been
oh,
angry that Spielberg had never responded. I thought, like, at least respond to the kid.
right, right,
And
right,
then, that was 1982. I realized there's no way my mother, who really, had a hard enough time as a parent anyway, had the wherewithal or the means in a non-internet world to find Steven Spielberg's address and mail me my letter to him.
right.
But, it is a signal that very early on in my life, I was drawn to books and then to movies and to
Hmm.
television. And I was always looking at it through this double lens, the lens of, I genuinely enjoy these things. I love what is happening on the screen or on the page, but also sort of really starting to, at an early age, deconstruct stories and see
Mm,
how they worked, and figure out what drew people in and what
yep.
didn't work and those kinds of things.
Do you think any leader can be a storyteller? Do you think some have like an exceptional gift of storytelling, or do you think there's like a level of storytelling that everybody can grab hold of? Some are more gifted, or I'd love to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a gift.
Okay.
I think it's a trained skill. I've taken the worst storytellers in the world and made them very, very good storytellers in a
Mm,
short period of time. I think the stumbling block for most leaders is it's an act of courage to tell a story, because what we're really asking leaders to do is to tell stories about themselves.
yep.
And when we ask them to tell stories about themselves, what we're really saying is, we don't want to hear about the time you succeeded. We want to hear about the time you struggled, the time you failed, the time
Yep.
you were embarrassed. Those are the courageous stories. Those are the ones that require courage. And so I work with a lot of companies and a lot of people who tell me they want to do storytelling. And I quickly discover, oh, it's just a word that they like to use, Because
Ah,
when we actually try to get them to tell a story in a meaningful way, so few of them are willing to sort of step out onto the ledge,
mm.
take the position at the tip of the spear. I worked with the CEO of Yale New Haven Hospital. She was giving a big talk to about 2,500 of her employees. And when I sat down with her and said, "What story do you want to tell?" She decided to tell the story of the time her hospital botched her husband's knee surgery, requiring a second surgery.
Oh, wow.
And you just don't meet leaders like that very often. And
Right?
her response to that story, the response she received was extraordinary. She said, "People
Mm.
started talking to me who had never spoken to me before." She said, from the parking garage to her office that next day, more people stopped her to either thank her for what she had
Wow.
done or tell her something about her organization that she needed to know that they didn't feel like they could tell her.
Wow.
But for every one of those, there's 10 people who say they want to tell a story, but when it comes down to actually doing so, it requires courage. It
Yeah.
requires you to do something that most people are not doing. And that is a hard thing, especially in corporate America, for people to be willing to attempt.
Wow. I mean, that is so powerful. Do you think do you think that level of authenticity is what holds people back? Because we sort of innately love to tell stories about ourselves, and to get outside of that, is just more difficult. I mean, what do you think is that main roadblock there?
I think there's a couple. I think one is when I tell people we need to talk more about your struggles than your successes. That's a
Mm,
challenge for people who have been successful all their lives
yep.
and who are constantly sort of speaking about their success. When you're looking for investment in your company, you usually don't get in front of people and say, "Well, here's the 3 times I failed." Although that would be extraordinary and probably very powerful in that moment, but people are unwilling to do it. But I think the bigger struggle is it's just not being done.
Mm,
I worked with a guy, a CEO actually, who was going to deliver a talk at a conference, a startup. And we worked a story that had a lot of humor in it because he wanted to be funny. And I think humor is fantastic and underdeployed and a useful strategy in a million ways. But he sat in the audience and he heard the first three speakers. None of them were funny. And so he pulled all the humor out of his talk
oh,
and instead delivered what everyone else was doing. And I said to him, "Well, the good news is you will have been forgotten. So if you were bad, don't worry. No one can remember anything you said."
right.
Right. But that's sort of what everyone's looking for is I want to be extraordinary, but I want to do it in the same way everyone else is doing it. Or I want you to magically guarantee me that what I'm about to do will be okay. And I can't do either one of those things, you know.
Wow.
So you have to be
Wow.
willing to step out and do the hard thing in order to be a storyteller or a funny speaker or all these things I want people to be.
Yeah. Okay. So you bring up humor. So incredibly important. Can anyone be funny? Can anyone bring, laughter to a story, or, is it something that they can learn? Because I mean, some people are pretty dull, pretty boring, and they tell
Uh,
themselves, "I'm not fun,"
I think the only thing they lack are the strategies
Mm,
to deconstruct humor and then repeat those strategies. So I teach 25 strategies for humor in one of the workshops I do, and they're all repeatable. They're all easy to do. I'm an elementary school teacher, so I believe in taking large, complex processes and breaking them down into small, repeatable parts.
wow.
And you don't even need all 25. If you learn 5 of them, you're already going to be funny. Now, I'm not guaranteeing that you're going to be funny sort of in a spontaneous at a dinner party, suddenly you're the life of the party kind of
Yes.
person.
Yep.
It's probably going to start with I'm going to craft humor into my talks in a strategic way. But you do that enough,
Yeah.
you're going to find strategies that come naturally to you. And then pretty soon you will find that you're going to be a funnier person. I think funny people tend to be better listeners than most people. We listen to what
Mm,
makes us laugh and then we ask ourselves, how can I reproduce what that person just did? And the better the listener, probably the funnier the person. But I can teach people how to do it. There's some very definable, simple to use strategies that you can start using today and instantly be funnier than you were yesterday.
wow. Wow. And I mean, laughter has such a way to build trust with the audience. And
Yeah.
it,
Well, it alters brain chemistry. When you make someone laugh, there's I'll say there's three. There's actually more than three, but there's three significant chemicals that are released in the brain whenever someone makes you laugh. One of them makes them feel better, and they
mm,
attach that good feeling to the source of the humor, which is you, so that means they like you more.
yeah.
One makes them feel better about the world. They feel a little safer in the space they're in. And the third one improves cognition, meaning
Mm,
they're going to understand what you are saying better because you've made them laugh. So it really is sort of like a drug for the brain. And any speaker that's not using humor, particularly early in a talk, when you want people to instantly sort of be attached to you and like you and feel that you're intelligent. That's another sign of humor. People think funny people are automatically smart, when I know a lot of funny people who are not. But you can get away with it if you're making
Right.
people laugh, right? So all of that is extraordinarily powerful and easy to use. And again, though, the problem is, in the business world, there's a great fear that if I try to be funny and no one laughs, I'm going to feel bad about myself and look foolish.
Mm.
And even if that was true, which I don't think is the case, if you're actually incorporating humor into your story, oftentimes, even when you attempt to be funny and there's no laugh, you're still telling a story. So it's okay. But
Yep.
even if that was true, even if you tried to be funny and no one laughed, at least now you're going to be memorable, because
Ah,
almost every speaker in every corporate setting in the world for the rest of eternity are utterly forgettable human beings. And every single thing they say is ultimately forgotten. So even if you fail and flop miserably, at least people will remember you. And that is not a bad thing.
absolutely. Wow. I just on a side note, uh you know, uh, always wanted to be a comedian. I don't have funny one-liners, so my stories, I draw things out and, just those everyday things that happen. And so I always wanted to audition for America's Got Talent as a storyteller, because
Uh-huh.
there's always comedians, there's always, but it'd be great. I mean, to see like an actual, you know, that storytelling, type of gift of people to be able to use because, it's just magical when they really work.
Yeah, I agree completely. My wife has said sometimes, she said, "You're kind of an unlikable person who tells a good story." And there's something to be said for that, because I
Yeah.
tend to be a rather opinionated human being who says things and knows he says things that will sort of set people awry. But because I'm also a storyteller and I am vulnerable and authentic and
Yep.
honest, and I'm willing to share my failures and embarrassments and shames, I can get away with more than
Right.
someone who's unwilling to do those things.
Right. It's amazing, once you share some of those things, people lean in, they're trusting you. What you'll be able to say to them, is just, you'll be able to speak truth in quite a powerful way.
Right. Even my TEDx talks, if you ever watch any of them, they always open with a story that is related to the idea I'm going to be speaking about. But I open with a story because by the time the story's done, the audience is prepared to receive any idea I have and are so much more likely to believe in what I'm about to say, because
Mm.
I've just shared an entertaining, vulnerable, genuinely authentic story about me. And now they feel
Yep.
they know me in a way that most people don't. It's funny how, like, people tell me secrets all the time. I tell a story on a stage and then someone just comes up to me, and without even
Right.
introducing, they just, I had a woman just before the pandemic. I told a story about bad parenting and I got off the stage and a woman came up to me and said, without even introducing herself, she said, "Every time I go into someone's house, even my own mother's house, I have to steal something." And then she grabbed me and pulled me in close, because people touch me all the time because they feel like they know me. They they
Right.
they pet
Right.
my arms like my wife sees it happening. She pulled me in and she whispered, yelled to me. She said, "I've never told anyone that before." So
Oh
this
my
40-year-old
goodness.
woman dealing with mental illness, a real mental illness,
Yeah.
decided one night in New York, the guy who just talked about bad parenting is the one I'm going to share my life secret with. And that happens to me all the time because I tell stories.
Wow. Ah, it's
I
just
could have sold
incredible.
her anything if I was in business at that point, right?
Right.
I could have said, "Listen, I'll hear your story, and also I think you should change the gutters in your house, and I've got a company that can replace all your
Right.
gutters." She would have said, "Yes, please."
Oh my goodness. That's incredible. Oh,
Yeah.
so take us into like the primary components of a story. What are the main parts of a really good story?
Well, most people sort of don't know what a story is, which is really the fundamental problem. Most people think a story is, I'm going to report on my life.
Mm.
I'm going to tell you about a time in my life where something extraordinary or not extraordinary happened, and I'm going to take you through that moment chronologically. Whereas a real story is about change over time. It's, I used to be one kind of a person, or I used to think one kind of thing, and some stuff happened, and now I see the world differently, or I see
Yeah.
myself differently. That has to be what happens for a story to make any sense. And that's for every movie you ever watch, every book you ever read, and every serialized television show that you ever watch. These are characters who start in one place and end in another place. And that's what is going to resonate with people. That's why we remember those stories. Where if you've got a buddy, like I had a guy who once told me the story about driving his car through the garage and into the pool accidentally, through the back of his garage into the swimming pool. And I said to him, like, well, what did that mean to you? And he said, well, I got lucky because I got to tell a really cool story at bars for the rest of my life. And I said, yeah, I know, but like on a personal,
Right.
intellectual, emotional, spiritual level, did you learn something? Were you a different person before you went through the garage than after? And he was like, nah, I'm just really happy I got to tell a good beer story. And so, like, the only reason I remember that story is because of how difficult I found that person to be and how I
Yeah.
couldn't get him to find any meaning in that moment.
Mm.
Otherwise, though, those stories get forgotten immediately. Those drinking stories, those
Yeah.
crazy night stories, they're entertaining, but they're like candy. You consume them and they're gone. Whereas a story that actually reflects some change over time, some real
Mm.
growth or actually de-evolution is just as good. I used to be an amazing person and now I'm a miserable soul. That's a great story too. If you don't have that, people don't remember it and it doesn't mean things to people and it can't be relatable to people. You can't relate to driving through a garage and ending up in a pool unless that person says, I used to think my father would never forgive me for any mistake I made. And then I ended up in the pool and somehow my father actually forgave me instantaneously. Now, if he had said that, everyone goes, oh, and it
Right.
doesn't even have to be your father. It can just be you're a father and you
Yep.
realize I need to find forgiveness in my heart. Or it could just be, I wish my boss would forgive me with the ease that that man's father. You can relate to the story now in a way that the plot itself is not relatable.
Boy, that's so good. So when it comes to stories, characters obviously play a pretty vital role. What are some of the key ingredients, to kind of crafting some, memorable characters, or just, um, painting the picture of who the character is, what they're about? Because so many people, I mean, they make, I was doing some coaching for a client recently, and they just said, I said, well, tell me a story. And they said, well, you're going to love the story. It's really funny. I was like, okay, well, don't start with that. But,
Right. Don't
you know,
start with that.
yeah, don't ever start with that. But then
No.
they started, painting the picture of the characters, and I was like, okay, hey, let's take us to the room. Where was the character? So, what are some of those, ways to create memorable, compelling characters?
Well, I think that one of the things that people make a mistake about is they often provide too much detail. I
Mm.
actually think that fewer adjectives yield more vivid stories, oddly.
Huh.
If I tell you, getting away from characters for a second, if I say I'm standing in a kitchen and I tell you nothing else about the kitchen, you can see that kitchen perfectly clearly because it's going to be your kitchen, your parents' kitchen, a kitchen you see on TV. And unless the particularities of that kitchen are relevant to my story, I actually want to harness your imagination and let you use a kitchen that you're most familiar with because that's going to be exceedingly vivid to you.
Uh huh.
So if I'm describing a story where I meet a beautiful woman, I'm going to say, a beautiful woman walks into the room. And if her physical appearance is not related to the story in any way, except for her beauty, I'm
Hmm.
going to leave it just like that. And you are going to put in your platonic version of a
Oh.
beautiful woman. And you're going to see it with a lot more clarity than I could ever achieve by trying to describe her. Right. So,
Yep.
like, I can't stand it when people start a story and they tell me a beautiful woman walks in and she's got the bluest eyes I've ever seen.
Mm.
Well, what you've essentially told me as a listener is she has blue eyes. Don't forget that because I gave you that detail. So it must be important at some point. And by the way, that's going to take away a little of your bandwidth along the way.
Mm.
Like you were remembering blue eyes is going to steal your ability to pay attention to other things. And if at the end of the
Ah.
story, blue eyes are not relevant to the story, you've just wasted my time. You've wasted
Right.
my energy. You've probably annoyed me. Right.
Right.
Now, they probably say blue eyes for one of two reasons. One is they love their wife's blue eyes and they want to say it.
Hmm.
But when we're storytellers, we're not in the business of saying what we want to say. We're in the business of saying what the audience wants to hear, right? The other reason they're probably
Wow.
doing blue eyes is because in first grade, when you learn how to write, teachers weirdly believe that more writing is better writing. So when you bring up a story to your teacher, they say this awful phrase, they say add details. But no
Mm.
one has ever finished a book in the history of the world and thought, boy, I wish there were more details in that book. It wasn't
Right.
quite as good because the eye color wasn't expressed often enough, right? But that's what we're taught to write when it comes to stories is like add hair color and all of that's irrelevant. So when we're trying to create characters, what we want to do, or when we're trying to convey characters to people, we want to find something that is essentially of their essence. And it's
Mm,
often not physical. It is often, my wife can't find her way out of a paper bag, right?
mm.
My wife has never met a human being who she can't have a very deep and meaningful conversation with in about 4 seconds, right?
Wow.
My wife is someone who used to make a giant mess whenever she cooked dinner until I started cooking dinner and everything was clean at the end. And so now everything's clean when she's done, but she refuses to acknowledge that it was my influence that changed her behavior.
Mm,
Right. Those are things about my wife that say something about my wife and allow you access to who she is as a person and not sort of what she looks like or what her job is unless it's relevant to the story. I'm going to choose those important essence qualities and they're going to be related to the story. I'm not going to tell you my wife can't find her way out of a paper bag unless it's a story about her getting lost, right? And I'm not going to tell you that my wife is an elementary school teacher, a kindergarten teacher, unless the fact that she being a kindergarten teacher is relevant to the story.
mm.
So we ask ourselves, what's the simplicity that we can provide that will be relevant to the story, but allow us to still harness the imagination of our audience so that you don't know what my wife Alicia looks like, but I don't care if you see her as the
Yeah.
brunette that she is. If you want to see her as a 6'2" blonde, and that is your version of beauty, and that works in my story, I'm going to let you have that view. It doesn't matter to me. And your view is going to be vivid, more vivid than anything I try to create.
Wow. That's so true. I think of, times when I've told a story and it's just rambled on and rambled on and rambled on. And I think back and I'm like, I made those mistakes, too many adjectives, too many details. And I robbed the audience of components where they could have been putting things together on their own.
Yeah, I like nouns that come with adjectives pre-attached. So I try to avoid all adjectives, and when I use one, it's going to be relevant in some way for the story. Otherwise, leverage the imagination of your audience because that imagination is more powerful than any number of words you can collect.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible. Just because I'm super curious and I've spoke with lots of preteen audiences and then teen audiences and then adults. How do you go about changing your material, or do you change your delivery? I mean, every day you get to communicate to preteens, and then you're coaching a CEO. How do you adjust or make that change, or is there really not much of a change?
Not much of a change. I'm a little more blunt, I guess, and specific with kids. Like
Mm,
when I tell a story, I'm probably telling it for a particular reason, a lesson. And I might be telling a story to an adult audience for the same reason, but adult audiences don't want to hear me say at the end of a story, and the lesson I'd like you to take away from that is
right.
so I'm telling a story to entertain them with the hopes that they're going to take something from it for their own life. With kids, I'm going to bonk them over the head with the lesson because they
Yeah.
just don't have that same level of introspection and nuance. Frankly, some adults don't either. But if they don't possess that
Right.
introspection and nuance, bonking them over their head when they're 37 is not going to make a difference at this point.
Right.
So I'm just a little more deliberate. I'm also very cognizant when I'm speaking to young people about the curse of knowledge, the idea
Mm,
that I am going to say things that will make no sense to them unless I define them. So when I
mm.
say I come out of a record store, you and I know what a record store is. But when I say it to students, I'm going to say I come out of a record store, which is a physical establishment that once sold music in a physical form that you could put in a bag and then
Right.
later put in a machine and it would play the music for you.
Wow.
Right. And I'll watch them to see if they nod and go, oh. And if they're still like quizzically looking at me, I'll be like, it was a store. It was a store where you bought music when it wasn't digital. Are we good? So that awareness is going to
Yeah.
be important. It's important for adults too. One of my friends was just telling a story in New York and she told me that her friend's pregnancy was an atopic pregnancy.
Mm.
And I knew I had heard that before because I've had two kids and I was sort of aware of it, but I wasn't aware of it enough to know what it meant. And I told her, I said, for 30 seconds while you were speaking, I was trying to go through my pregnancy vocabulary to figure out what that meant. So I said, in
Oh,
that case, you have to know she's having an atopic pregnancy, which means, and you're going to have to define it. So
yeah.
as storytellers, we have to constantly quiz ourselves as to what I have to say. The worst one are cell phones. I have a story where I say I'm stuck on the side of a highway in 1991 and there's no way for me to get help. And when I get off the stage, all these like honestly 25-year-olds will come up to me and say, "Why don't you just use your cell phone?"
Right.
And I used to say, "Well, it was 1991." And they go, "Yeah." And I go, "My God." So now my story has to be, it's
Yep.
1991. So there are no cell phones, which I hate saying because essentially I'm bringing in technology that didn't exist at the time
Right.
and being required to say it. I'm
Right.
creating an anachronism of sorts in my story,
Wow.
but I have to do it. But other than those things, the stories I tell to kids are very much similar to the stories I tell to adults, although the content might be different.
Yep.
The time I had to provide a genetic sample prior
Right.
to making babies, that is not a story I tell my students, but that
Right.
is one I'm willing to tell adults.
Right. Right, right. So good. I have so many more questions. Our time's running to an end. I want to honor our time. But you brought up with your kids, how important was parenting? I'm sorry. How important is storytelling in your parenting? Like, have you told as your kids have grown up, made storytelling an important part of it? I'm always so curious about that.
Yeah, it's very important. My mom passed away in 2007 before my kids were born.
Mm.
And I wasn't sort of aware of it at the time, but when you lose a parent, what essentially happens is the hard drive crashes on any story that you didn't get already or any question that you never asked.
Wow.
And so suddenly being aware of that, particularly when my wife got pregnant and she gave birth through an emergency C-section, I found myself wondering, hey, how was I born? And did I nurse? Like, or
Yep.
was I bottle fed? And
Yep.
when did I walk? And what was my first word? And all of that kind of stuff. And I didn't have any of it. And so I suddenly understood, if I don't tell my kids everything, and I don't commit it in writing in some places. I wrote to
Yep.
my kids for the first 8 years of their lives and then had it produced in these beautiful books that sit in our house now.
Oh,
But my kids know my stories and they love
yeah.
hearing them again and again. And so I just think it's critical as parents that we're sharing those things because as terrible as it is, I can get hit by a bus tomorrow. And
Yeah.
I have either made the choice now to be known to my children or to not be known. And frankly, my mom made the choice not to be known. She just didn't tell me very much. And I was too stupid to ask, thinking she was going to be around a lot longer than she was. So as part of parenting, I have made it my life goal to make sure that my kids know me as well as they possibly can in the event a plane falls on my head tomorrow.
Wow. That's so incredibly powerful. Thank you so much. Before I let you go, and I thought we'd just do a couple rapid fire questions, let our audience kind of
Sure.
keep getting to know you. But who's one of your favorite storytellers? Do you have a favorite storyteller?
Steve Zimmer, who's a storyteller in New York City, is my favorite storyteller. If you go to YouTube, you can watch some of his stories. Actually, if you go to themoth.org, I think they have about 8 of his stories in audio form that you can listen to. I just think he's extraordinary.
Awesome. Well, and we'll make sure we link that in the show notes. If you're a podcast person, is there one for your development or one from your guilty pleasure that you just love that you would highly recommend to other leaders, communicators?
Yeah, I mean, I love many, many of them. I guess right now, because I'm working on a solo show, sort of a 90-minute solo show. Mike Birbiglia is one of my favorite storyteller comedians, and he has a podcast called Working It Out, where he talks with other creative people about their process. So I
Hmm.
enjoy that one. But honestly, I enjoy about 50 more of them too. So I listened to today alone to Revisionist History, which is Malcolm Gladwell's podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I listened to Freakonomics and heard Satya Nadella of Microsoft talking about the strategy for his company moving forward. And I listened to This Week in Esoteric Political History. I learned about Superman versus the Ku Klux Klan, which was a series in the 1950s where Superman battled the KKK, except it was an alternate version of the KKK. So all of those were just
Huh.
today that I listened to.
I love it. I love it. Fantastic. Okay, last question. If Tom
Yes.
Brady wouldn't have left the Patriots, would he have finished on a high note, his last couple seasons with them?
He would have had one more championship, I'm pretty sure. I think that, as a Patriots season ticket holder, I've been very and I used to live one town over from Foxborough. So,
Oh,
even when I wasn't a season ticket holder, I would drive to the stadium, buy a ticket because we were terrible and I could just walk in at any time I wanted.
wow. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that the defense of the New England Patriots has been strong enough over the last 3 years that a reasonable quarterback and our outstanding running back would have been enough to get him at least one more championship.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I agree. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Can you point our listeners somewhere online where they can find more about you and what you do?
Sure. If they go to matthewdix.com, you can kind of find everything there. If you're looking particularly for storytelling, if you go to Storyworthy MD, my initials MD.com, there's lots of free resources. There's courses there. There's lots of links to places where I teach about storytelling. So you can find a lot of information, particularly on storytelling there.
Fantastic. And I'll make sure we link all that in the show notes so we have that available. Well, thank you again for joining us. This was just a privilege. I took pages of notes and I'm going to go back through and grab some more because I hope for our listeners, but boy, for me, it was pretty impactful. So thank you.
I'm really glad. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you to our listeners for listening every single week. Make sure if you have missed it, the pathway is out and it is available for you. If you need to communicate in public, your boss has asked you to give a presentation, you have to craft a new sales presentation, you have to do a keynote address, but you want to make sure that you kind of craft your public speaking skills, go to speakwithpeople.com/thepathway. It's a step-by-step guide to become a more confident, clear, and captivating communicator. Well, thanks again for being a part of the podcast. Really appreciate every time you listen, every time you share, and every single one of your reviews. Again, this podcast exists because healthy communication is oxygen for our relationships and our leadership. So whether you communicate one-on-one, from a stage to a team, or from behind a screen, we hope that our time today really encouraged you and inspired you to communicate in healthy ways and change your world with your words. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.